First of all, thank you so much for being here. I said to you in my email, I'm a huge fan of your work. Have immensely enjoyed all of your books, and in particular, like the Little Book of Aliens. And I'd love to get to it. At some point uh, during our conversation. And I uh, I don't really like to think of it as an interview. It's more like as an exchange of ideas and
Yeah.
perspectives. Yeah, because and I guess that's like a large part of what your life has been about. Yeah, and like and for me that's also been the case. And yeah, it's and it just sounds better when you put it this way. Yeah, like it's not this like formal kind of style, but just yeah, there's been just many questions that have like baffled me, and I'd love to see if you could uh, try and illuminate those. And like this whole project, the entire idea behind it is to try and uh, and dive into these big questions. And a large part of my like percentage of my audience is Ukrainians, my fellow citizens. And like through these conversations, I hope to be able to give them the chance to like think about something else, to think about other things, and to get their like to take their mind away from that, like painful day to day, like
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, science, these big questions have always sort of played that role for people
yeah,
because life is hard, right? There's a lot of different ways for there to be suffering in the world. You guys are in the midst of a war, right?
yeah,
But then on a personal level, there's the suffering of, people get sick, people get old, and so there has always been a way in which we've turned to these big questions as a kind of comfort to remind us that our particular stories are just part of they're small compared to these larger stories. And for some people like me, there's a certain comfort in that our individual narratives, our individual stories with considerable suffering, are part of a much larger book. And somehow that makes it feel a little bit less. It's like you have more room. Like you still have your suffering. It's not going away, but it's not in a closet, that you're experiencing it. It's in a much bigger space. And so there's more room for different kinds of feelings.
yeah. It's actually now I can very well imagine, a bunch of cavemen, for example, like sitting around the fire, and like 20, 30,000 years ago, and like discussing exactly, this kinds of big questions. But, they just didn't have the benefit of, all this scientific knowledge. But, it's exactly, to your point, like, we've always been asking ourselves, this kinds of questions. But, only recently have we had like the privilege of actually understanding what's going on, like in terms of
Right.
science. Yeah, yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right. At least, and right. So like people looked at the stars for years and they had their own explanations. They had their own, myths and which, functioned for them. But right, what's unique about science is that science gives us a way to validate our stories, right? And I'm not somebody who thinks that science can explain everything, that everything is science. I think that really undervalues the full range of what it means to be human or means to be alive. But there certainly are certain kinds of questions that science does an incredible job of giving us answers that we really can believe, that we, really have a sense that this answer is true. So, for example, what is a star, right? For a zillion years, people looked at the points of light in the sky and asked themselves what they were and came up with all kinds of narratives. But now, we know that those things are giant balls of gas undergoing fusion. So that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and actually, on that note, um, do you ever have that sense, when you, for example, look up at the stars, and like you said, you know what a star is, and what it's made of, and how it works. And for example, when you look up at those like distant stars, and you see that light that's like coming to us from like even thousands or millions of light years away, and then like millions of light years or millions of years later, it hits your eyeballs. And do you ever like have that sense of I'm just so happy to be able to experience this, somehow like that this knowledge of how this works like enhances your experience of maybe seeing
Yeah,
the night
yeah,
sky. Yeah,
It does. There's a famous poem by the American poet Walt Whitman. I think it's called "On Listening to the Learned Astronomer." And in that he sort of, and I love Whitman, but he bemoans, he sort of is sad. He's listening to a technical talk by an astronomer talking about the stars, and he steps outside and he looks at the stars, and he's sort of sad that, oh, the astronomer has reduced this to this knowledge. And I always thought, like, Whitman, you missed the point there, actually. It's much broader. I mean, actually knowing what the stars are doesn't make it less, doesn't diminish the beauty. You still can step outside and feel the beauty of the night sky that everybody has always felt. But on top of it, you now also get this additional sense of how vast and how rich and how multi-storied the universe is. So as you said, when I look at the stars at night, what I don't see is a bowl, with like, painted dot, two-dimensional bowl with dots painted on it. I see that each star is at a different distance. And so I suddenly get this sense, and I had this as a kid when I was growing up in New Jersey, right outside of New York City, very urban place. I used to go up to my roof and lie on my back, and I'd look up at the stars, and I'd try and get this perspective shift, where they were no longer just like this plane in the sky with dots on them, but suddenly I could see that some were closer, some were farther, and they weren't above me. They were actually all around me. There were stars behind me, there were stars ahead of me, and I suddenly got my sense, I could get this physical sense as if I wasn't lying on my back. I was sort of like, just standing in space, surrounded by stars at all different distances. And the whole three-dimensional structure of these stars strewn across space at all kinds, like I said, some close to me, some at vast, vast distances. And it just made me feel like I was part of something so much larger. And I grew up in a pretty bad situation. I grew up, we didn't have much money. So things were pretty hard. I lost my brother. My brother died in a car accident when I was 9. Um, and I got so much comfort from that perspective. It really helped me see that my story was just one of many, many, perhaps an infinite number of stories. And it gave me more space to deal with what I was going through.
And would you say, for example, that I mean, it's hard to give like a precise answer to this, but that for example, our ancestors, when they were again like contemplating this big questions and looking up, at the night sky, like there's so much order to this, to this realm, but that here on Earth we have like all this like chaos and this wars and so on. And do you think that it would it be natural for them to come up with this like deities and these ideas of God, because the the heavens seemed like entirely like different realm, which isn't the case from what we know about from science, but
Right.
like yeah, for me, I guess if you don't have that benefit of knowledge, I guess it's kind of natural, yeah, maybe to assume that there is like yeah, just a completely different world, and maybe one that we can enter after we die. I don't know what you
Right,
make of
right.
it. Yeah.
It's interesting though. I mean, right, we sort of it's so hard for us to look back and imagine the world that our early ancestors lived in, because we're always mapping our understanding of ourselves back onto them. And so I was reading, actually, there's a really lovely book called Myth by Karen Armstrong. She's a great studier of science, of mythology and religion. And she points out that actually the idea that the sky gods, that like God lived up in the sky and was very distant and wasn't involved with you, that actually kind of came later. That came more once you got the Egyptians, right? In the, before that, people were God wasn't up in the sky and distant. The gods, or God or the gods, were actually very close. They were in the trees, they were in the animals, you lived in a world that was full of sacredness. The world was rich and alive. And that my first book was about this. My first book was about science and religion, but I was trying to point out that what matters because I'm not super hostile to religion like some scientists are. I mean, organized religion is always about politics and power. That's just because it's a human beings, that's what human beings do. But behind that is the feeling of sacredness, that the world, is more. There's more going on in the world just than my day-to-day, suffering and my day-to-day back and forth. That there's something rich and beautiful about the world. And I think this is what animates science too. So I think, right, yeah, that sort of idea that God was this distant being out there in the sky came later from actually an original sort of experience of just the world is, full of richness. And then yeah, and then yeah, so yeah, right. So that idea that the sky was the place of God, of a distant deity is actually came a little bit later for us. And in some sense, what I'd like to see, what I was arguing in that book was that science actually is a way to experience sacredness, however you want to define it. Obviously science has a hard time with the supernatural, right? And I agree with that. But science certainly is a path to understand, to being able to see the night sky as something alive with the sacred, the feeling of the sacred.
And for you personally, um, like, would you say that you've always been asking yourself these kinds of the questions, ever since you were a little kid? Yeah, maybe could you kind
Yeah.
of remember as a maybe 10-year-old, you had thoughts in your head about like what I'm doing here, and and is there like someone out there? Yeah.
Absolutely. I was, so my story about astronomy is that when I was 5 years old, my dad was a writer who loved science and science fiction. And he had all of these books, what are called pulp science fiction magazines. These were magazines in the 50s and 60s that always they were made on cheap paper. They'd come out once a month and they were full of stories, science fiction stories. And the covers of these things always had these awesome, art, paintings basically of guys in spaceships, or illustrations of bug-eyed monsters and the spaceships and I remember the cover was of like rocket ships on a moon, right? And of course this was a 1960s version before the moon landing, so it didn't look anything like what we know now. But I remember I'm 5 years old and I was just like, whoa, like this was the coolest thing ever. And like that was it. I wanted to be an astronomer from that moment on. Never changed, never did anything else. So I've always had these questions. And then of course, the hardship I was going through, the loss of my brother, made me really wonder, like, what is this? What is life? Like it's clear that it doesn't last, right? It's clear that your contract, can be canceled at any time. It's fleeting. It's all fleeting. And so what is this? And yet these stars and these things last for millions, hundreds of millions, billions of years. And so life is just so weird that yeah, I still want answers.
No, but it's amazing because you managed to combine like sudden life and sudden the universe, with like your book in astrobiology. Like, so yeah. And, but it's like for me it's also interesting. Did you have, because people can have a big impact on you also, and maybe could you remember someone from your childhood who had like maybe like a teacher or
It was really my dad.
yeah.
My dad was the
Relatives.
one who, my parents were divorced. My dad lived in New York City. I lived in New Jersey. Maybe like, it's only a half an hour out. But, it took a while to get in. And, Manhattan's so big that it's a barrier in itself. But, I would see my dad every 2 weeks or so, as was the way it was in the 1970s. But he would always take me to the Hayden Planetarium, the big planetarium in New York City. And he understood that I was in love with science and he really fostered it in me. So that was really the beginning. And then at night he used to like kind of wake me up, me and my sister would go to bed and then he would wake me up and he'd, say, come on out, come on out. And then we'd watch science fiction movies together. He loved science fiction movies. And that made a big impression on me. So when I was a kid, where I grew up in New Jersey, there was not really, I mean, my high school was pretty bad. I had some good teachers, but not really in science. Nobody was really into science. I had some good English teachers. But in terms of science, I was pretty much on my own. And it was my dad's early influence that sort of, led me to fall in love with science. Because what happened is by the time I was like 15 or 14, I started going into New York by myself. I just took the train in and I'd go to the Hayden Planetarium religiously. That was my temple. And I remember like standing in front of the statue of Albert Einstein, and on it it has the equations, the equations of relativity, and that made such a huge impression on me. And after when I was in undergraduate, when I was like trained, by the end of undergraduate, I did an honors project where I learned Einstein's the field theory, and I came back and I stood at that statue and I cried because I knew what those, finally, after all those years, I knew what those symbols meant. And yeah, that was pretty cool.
And for I'd love to touch upon this like big questions. Like one is like in the history of science, and theology and philosophy for that matter. Like we often hear the word disenchantment. It gets used a lot of times because, for example, there's like very famous notion of the god of the gaps. Like for example, whenever we discover something new about nature, about the world, like there is just less and less room for God because scientists would say that we can actually explain this like through X, Y, and Z, and like we don't need any like supernatural deity, and like so disenchantment is kind of pointing to this process in which it seems like everything has been disenchanted because of this like discoveries the scientists have made, and these are like usually religious folks who like push this idea, and uh, but I often hear scientists like yourself who speak with just a big smile on your face about this about these things, and you don't at all seem like you're um, you're like disenchanting, and like so I'm just curious now, how would you respond to that notion of like of the scientist as the one who like somehow disenchants when you like clearly seem to have this like when you clearly have this like sense of wonder and awe before
I'm
all.
very enchanted.
Yeah,
I'm still very enchanted
yeah.
by science. Well, so, recently, I and two others wrote a book called The Blind Spot: Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience. And what we were, so my other two authors were Marcelo Gleiser, my good buddy, who's a theoretical physicist, and Evan Thompson, who is a philosopher, sort of focuses on philosophy of mind and cognitive science and such. And our argument in that book was that this I think it's really true that there is a disenchantment that has come because of the scientific culture. But what we were saying, it's not science that was the problem with that. It was a philosophy, a metaphysics that got glued onto science, that the adherents of this philosophy will say, oh, this is what science says. Science says you are nothing but, computations happening in your brain, and those computations are happening in neurons, and those neurons are nothing but, the molecules in the cells, and those molecules are nothing but atoms, blah blah blah, all the way. This is a philosophy, a metaphysics called reductionism that says all there is are these base layers of quarks or whatever, and everything in the world is built out of them, and nothing is really real except that base layer. And everything that has ever happened, everything that is experienced is really not real. Only that base layer is real. And so that is a philosophy that science doesn't say that. Science never said that. That is a philosophy. It's a metaphysics. And along with it comes a certain kind of way of looking at the world and what is of value, what is important. And what we were trying to point out in that book is like, that is not science at all. That's a particular philosophy. And it's fine to have philosophies. It's fine to have metaphysics as long as you admit that that's your philosophy. Saying that science tells you this is just, is kind of entirely wrong and deceptive. And, the world what happened was, what we were arguing was, is that because science is so powerful, it's so powerful at gaining new knowledge, knowledge that can be put to use, that early on, as science was being built in the 16th century and the 17th century, politics and economy, right, got merged, drew from science, right? They were using science to build their factories and everything. But the idea of what is an economy, what economics should be, how the relationship between the resources that the world produces and and us, a certain kind of political economic philosophy was built that was really built on that false philosophy that was getting attached to science. And it was a world where, like, the world is disenchanted. A mountain, right? A mountain covered in forest. The only way in this philosophy to see it is, oh, it's just wood. It's just resources to be extracted. The only way to value or think about the mountain is how many board feet, that's the unit for lumber, is in the forest. It's blind to the ecosystems and their own inherent value, right? It can't see anything except in this reductionist, materialist, or physicalist lens. And what we are arguing in that book is, like, this is not science. This is a particular philosophy and metaphysics, and it's done a lot of damage to us. And we should be able to separate the beauty of science and the beauty that science reveals, and that metaphysics. Because if not, we're going to have a hard time having a beautiful, incredible, complex human civilization that is going to be long term. Because with things like climate change and now the dangers of AI and such, we're going to make the wrong choices and it'll bring down society. It's not going to bring down the Earth. The Earth's fine. The Earth's going to last for a long time. But this complex society we all rely on, that is what is threatened by not by that disenchantment. How is that?
Yeah, it's perfect. It's like, but for example, now it also relates to this question of significance, for me, because how about, I have this lovely virtual background, as you can see, yeah, like with our planet and outer space. And for example, when you, yeah, just look at some of those images, from the James Webb or the Hubble, whatever, that does it, and this like fact that we have what currently like 2 trillion galaxies, yeah, at least, but it's the numbers keep like
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's just
yeah.
uh, but it's does it don't you ever, find yourself feeling kind of depressed when contemplating how small we are, compared to this like vast and universe that doesn't seem to care about us at all, and we're just this insignificant. Yeah, how would you respond
Right.
to that?
Two things. First of all, the idea the universe is vast and I'm small, it just, like, I don't find it significant. I find it a relief. Right? Like, hey man, like, pardon my language, my shit doesn't matter, right? Like, this story I'm telling myself about how, oh my God, all my concerns, the things I'm worrying about, it actually tells me that, like, lighten up. Universe, like I said, there's a lot of stories. The universe is a very big book, and your life is a paragraph. So, like, lighten up, enjoy the ride. As the Warren Zevon was a musician who I really liked. He died, of cancer, 20 years ago or so. And he said, as he was dying, he wrote, I think one of his quotes when he recognized he was dying was, enjoy every sandwich. I mean, why do we have to be significant? Like, where does being significant to the universe make things better, right? It just makes things worse. Um, but then also that idea that, an uncaring universe, again, that is very much what we would, from our book, call the blind spot. That's a blind spot view. That is an outside view, right? That's a view of, like, the God's eye view of the universe, which, again, part of the blind spot philosophy is that there is such a thing as an outside view of the universe that's outside of perspective, that's outside of that. There's a way of talking about the universe without us, right? There's a way of talking about the universe that doesn't include us in the story. But actually, fundamentally, from a fundamental kind of philosophical point of view, there's no such thing, right? Because, right, that view that you have behind you in your thing, this is what we do when we try to imagine the objective view of the universe. We imagine ourselves floating out in space, looking down, but we also imagine that we're not there, right? So we imagine a perspective, but there's nobody there to have the perspective. And what we have to recognize is that's a fantasy, right? There is this God's eye view of the universe, this objective frame, as we call it philosophically, is a very useful tool for doing science and doing philosophy, but you have to recognize no one's ever had it. No one's ever had a perspectiveless perspective. No one has ever had or could have the God's eye view, except God, him or herself, and what are you going to do with that? So the reality is that all of our knowing, all of our storytelling about the universe comes from our perspective. We look out on the world together, right? Each I look out on the world, you look out on the world, but also I couldn't really look out on the world and have any ideas about it if I wasn't part of a community of others, right? So there's only what truly only exists are first and second person perspectives. First person perspective, because that's me, but also I can't no being, no human being, and no form of life appears by itself. It's always a community, right? And really, the whole planet, the biosphere, is really the correct unit there to think of. So, this idea of significance, we are profoundly significant because there's no way for us to tell the story of the universe without us in it. We're the storytellers. There is no cosmic view, right? We're the ones who, by being already experiencing, we're already enmeshed in the world, right? There's no way to separate the world out from us. That always, in telling these stories about the Big Bang and everything, it's still, you can't take us out of it. And that to me is a revolution that has to happen in science, right? In order to, and that's what the book, The Blind Spot, was about. But it's in all my writing. I've always been focused on experience, on the what I would call the primacy of experience or the irreducibility of experience. Your experience right now as you're sitting there looking at the screen, you can't, there's no unit of it. You can't break it apart. It's a whole. It is an inseparable whole. And so coming to terms with that, what that means is we are going to have to give up this idea that nature's out there, right? Nature is something separate from us and apart from us. But we have to recognize that what we're given is experience. I wake up every morning, I'm in the world, I can't get out until I die, and then who the hell knows what's going on. But I can never leave experience. So therefore, nature, fundamentally, nature, the universe, starts with me, and it starts with you. It starts with us. That's the only way to frame any kind of description. And any attempt to push off into this God's eye view is it's a fantasy, right? So if you want to be hardcore, if you want to be in philosophy, excuse me for a minute if I go on to this. In philosophy, there's the position of being a realist. Like if you're a realist, you believe in a mind-independent reality, and they're hardcore, they're not, going to mess around with any kind of fruity tooty. But really, they're not realists. They're dealing with a fantasy, which is this third person view. The realists are people who start with experience. Not, I'm not arguing that what exists is mind. No, what I start with, what I get, what I can't escape is experience. And that's where I should begin all my scientific and philosophical investigations.
Yeah, and actually, I love that quote. I don't remember, unfortunately, who said it, that the universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories, It's kind of like, well,
That,
yeah,
who made that? Oh my God, what's her name?
yeah, yeah.
She's a poet. Muriel Rukeyser.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah,
Really important, right? That I've been using that my whole life. So just for people to hear it again, the universe is not made out of atoms. It's made out of stories. And Muriel Rukeyser was an amazing poet in the 1930s and 40s. But here's the thing, she wrote this, that's how I discovered her. A friend of mine turned me on to her. She wrote a incredible biography, a scientific biography of Willard Gibbs, who was the guy one of the founders of statistical mechanics. And her biography of him is so scientifically accurate. I mean, I want to know more about this woman because she wrote the most beautiful poetry and had that quote and clearly was scientifically adept. Um, and yet right, so she lived in both worlds, and I think it's really important that a poet, was is able to say that, is able to. It was a poet who recognized that there's no escaping from us, from experience. That's where you have to start, and don't get the disenchantment, right? If you start there, if you recognize I can't get away from experience, right? This is where I begin. That's where the enchantment is, because every moment, I look out right now and there's, trees in my yard. You can't see that from the deck of the Enterprise, but actually I'm in a room with and those trees, like, wow, man, they're beautiful. And they've been there for 100 years. And so the enchantment of the world is always available to us every moment if we are willing to pay attention. The disenchantment comes when we sort of push ourselves out, right? We ignore ourselves and try to view the world from the outside. And that's where all the screw up starts to happen.
Yeah, okay. The James Webb Space Telescope, it's just fascinating to me this that we've been able to build and put in space, this like amazingly complex device, just incredible. And one of the things, as I know, that it was designed to do is to study the atmospheres of exoplanets. Right, yeah, and so, like this planets orbiting other stars, and I'm just curious, like, have there been any discoveries, in regards to these exoplanets that have come out of, the James Webb, that have been maybe useful for you in your research, or
Yeah. Oh
just
my
super?
God.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So this idea, so we're switching now to some hardcore science, which is super fun. So now we're going to talk about astrobiology, right? The study of life in the universe outside, non-Earth life in the universe. I mean, one of the huge revolutions over the last 20 years, 30 years, first was the discovery that there are any planets orbiting other stars, which literally nobody knew for 2,000 years or more. And you can see the ancient Greeks arguing with each other about it. I mean, it's amazing that we all live in a time when this ancient question was totally answered, right? The question of whether or not, excuse me, whether there's life, whether there's other planets, we now know for sure. We've answered that question. Every star in the sky has planets orbiting it. So now we're interested, is there other life in the universe? So the JWST has the capacity to do what is called atmospheric characterization. We can detect in the light from the star, we can detect other planets. We can see by looking at these stars, we can see the other planet that the star has planets orbiting it. And then we have the ability, when the planet passes in front of the star, to actually catch some of the light that passes through the planet's atmosphere, if it has one, and then look for the chemical fingerprints that tells us what's actually in the atmosphere, what compounds, what gases are in the atmosphere. So, what we believe is, and we have good reason to believe this, is that life will pump gases into an atmosphere that wouldn't otherwise be there. Like if there was no life, you'd get a different atmospheric composition than if there is life. So now JWST is kind of just on the hairy edge of being able to do this. So what would these gases would be called biosignatures, right? So as an example, right, we know in general, most, an average planet with no life on it, an Earth, a terrestrial planet, a rocky planet, will have atmosphere. We'll probably end up with an atmosphere with a lot of carbon dioxide in it and probably molecular nitrogen, right? So if we saw those things in a planet's atmosphere, it would be cool because we'd be learning about this planet that's 50, 60 light years away. But there wouldn't be anything in there that would tell us there's life. But if we saw oxygen in the planet's atmosphere, from everything we know, oxygen will not stay in a planet's atmosphere unless there's life there to pump it back out. It'll react very quickly with all the rocks on a rocky planet so that the oxygen will quickly go away. Earth did not have oxygen in its atmosphere for the first 2 billion years of its life, even though there was life on the planet. Oxygen came only when life discovered a certain kind of photosynthesis, a new kind of photosynthesis that used water as a substrate and then broke the water apart and spit the oxygen atoms out. So JWST can do atmospheric characterization for sure, right? But finding, you really need to be so sensitive. Your telescope has to be so powerful to be able to detect these, gases, these trace gases, what may be small amounts of gas in an atmosphere. So JWST is right at the edge of being able to do that. We might be able to find biosignatures with JWST. But we'll be lucky if we do. But what it can do is it can do in general, it can do atmospheric characterization for other kinds of gases that are probably easier to detect. And that's still very useful. So my favorite example of this is one thing that we've discovered with astrobiology is that the most common kind of planet in the universe or in the galaxy is exactly the kind of planet that does not exist in our solar system. So in our solar system, we've got Earth, which has a mass of one Earth mass. And then there's nothing up until you get to Uranus and Neptune, which are about 14 or 17 Earth masses. So there's no planets with like 5 Earth masses. It turns out planets with 5 Earth masses, 8 Earth masses, 10 Earth masses, they're everywhere. Every other solar system almost in the galaxy has them. So we don't know anything about what these planets are like because we don't have one in our solar system. So recently there was a proposal that some of these sub-Neptunes, things that maybe have 8 Earth masses, are not going to look like Neptune at all. They're not going to be like frozen, slushy, gassy balls. Instead, they're going to be what are called hydrogen ocean worlds or Hycean worlds. So these would be planets that are big. They have atmospheres of molecular hydrogen, but below that, they have oceans. They have warm oceans that may go down 600 kilometers, right? Earth's oceans at its deepest is like 7 kilometers. So this was an idea that someone proposed. And then JWST looked at an 8 Earth mass planet called KB18b. And they were able to do the atmospheric characterization and to see what was in the atmosphere. And they saw very clearly there was methane and very clearly there was carbon dioxide in the right levels that indicated this was a Hycean world. This was a hydrogen ocean world. And so, we still lots and lots of work to do, but that was freaking awesome, right? Not only could we see the atmosphere of this planet with enough accuracy to be able to tell very clearly the atmosphere has got methane and it's got carbon dioxide in it, but it was also at the levels which would be like, oh, this is exactly what we'd expect for one of these new kinds of planets that we've never seen before, that we dreamed up, or not dreamed up, but that, that was theoretical until now, these Hycean worlds. And if you have an ocean if you have liquid water that's at, 20 degrees centigrade, then, that could be a place where life formed. Doesn't mean life did form, but certainly it's a place where life could form. So that's a result from JWST that is super exciting.
Yeah, and I sometimes hear people say that, well, it costed $10 billion or so, yeah, and like, why spend all this money on this like telescope when we know we've got all these other problems, but to me it's like, first of all, like in this scheme of things, $10 billion is not that much, I mean, like Russia spends, way more, on this war, on like this stupid, yeah, and for example, and then second, from what I understand, like this basic research, like curiosity-driven research, it often leads to like some amazing technological developments, right? And for example, and you don't know where it might come from. Like for example, I know there are like lots of like examples of amazing technology that have come out of the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, like that are used, for example, for cancer treatment and so on. This and it seems to me like when you just asking this like fundamental questions, like somewhere along the way, some smart person, might come up with some like I don't know, like amazing technology that might maybe help us improve our lives, So I guess for me it's just a very short-sighted view, that some people might have. I don't know how would you respond to this? That
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, there's so many ways in which that view is just doesn't make sense, right? I mean, you and I, you're in the Ukraine, I'm in upstate New York, and we're talking to each other live, right? Using technology that almost all of it came because of what we call basic science, science like astronomy. So, for example, the HTTP that you see at the beginning of all that came that those protocols, that computer science came out of, astronomy and basic physics. One of the first web browsers, the whole idea of a web browser came from a computational astrophysics laboratory because they were trying to send pictures back and forth. A researcher in Europe, a researcher in the Ukraine might be wanting to send a picture that they had, an image that they had just taken from a telescope to a researcher in the United States. And so one of those astronomers invented the protocols, the whole formalism for sending pictures back and forth on the internet. This was like 1989. So, gee, was that useful? Did that end up having any economic impact, right? Did the internet have an economic impact? So there's that level, right? So it's just like, the you know, these scientific advances throughout history have always, the countries that invest in those kinds of scientific advances are both the countries, sadly, that militarily, I mean, it's obviously of use in military. I wish we didn't use it for that, but economically are always the ones that are the most viable. So, like, the relationship between the wealth of your nation and your degree to which you're applying doing just like basic science. And by basic science, meaning asking fundamental questions about the universe, about it, they're directly correlated. Um, and then the other thing is, those pictures, right? So right now, behind you is this image, right? And that image came with Zoom, right? It's one of the images that Zoom gives you. How many people use that image? Because it's beautiful and it's moving, right? The images from the JWST, they're going to find their way to album covers. They're going to find their way into music videos. They're going to be part of human culture. One of the things that really struck me with Marvel movies, how quickly Marvel movies, when they were showing images from space, like Thor, the first or the second Thor movie, they were using images from, it wasn't it wasn't Hubble, it was oh my God, which was the infrared my brain isn't working. Sorry. There were images from one of the telescopes that came after Hubble, what used to be known as Certif. Uh, so these images that are being taken, they are so important to human culture. They get distributed everywhere. Everyone marvels at them. So both on the practical use of or the practical applicability of this kind of, doing a basic astronomy or, taking pictures of the universe. And then, meaning economic impact, and then the cultural impact, both views of like we should be spending the money on other things, like it's beyond narrow-minded. It just ignores human culture and human history. And also, as you said, $10 billion, ask how much we spent on beer last year, right? The world spent on beer, right? It's a lot more than $10 billion. So like if everybody drank like half a beer less, over the year, then we would have space stations orbiting Jupiter, So it's like, yeah, it's a little short-sighted.
well, I'm happy that you mentioned these beautiful images because I have one. I hope you'll be able to see. I'm
Yeah.
showing off.
No, I can't see it actually. I can't. It's
Uh,
not.
no,
No,
can
it's not. Oh wait, what is it? I see a rainbow. It's like a piece of.
it's the pale blue dot image. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. If you
Right, the pale blue
yeah,
dot
yeah,
image.
yeah.
What was that
Yeah, yeah,
image?
exactly. And
Uh,
it was it was taken like for no like real scientific reason because there was like no science that was learned from it, but the kind of impact that it's had on our culture is incredible. Yeah, yeah,
no, I mean, think about the image. The history. Like, imagine. Remember that there was this image taken from the moon. That image of the Earth, the Earthrise, right? That image. has utterly transformed how we think about ourselves. Like it is profoundly shaped, and it was this first image of the Earth, the Apollo 8, they were going around the moon, and as they came around, they saw the Earth rise above the moon, and the guy snapped the photo of it. And like that image has utterly changed how humanity thinks about itself. So like, was it worth the $10 billion for that space mission? Yeah, you know.
And it's a very fun question to ask. And first because we don't know much about it, but what about like intelligent life? Like I hear people, well, people would say, like the universe is so vast, and we got this like 2 trillion galaxies and whatever, and like there is just has to be some other civilization out there. But on the other hand, it seems to me that like if we take our planet as an example, it took like 4 billion years, right? More or less, yeah, for intelligent life to appear here, and and some would say like that love a comment by Stephen Hawking that he doubted that intelligent life has really emerged on the planet, but it's uh,
That's
but
always the joke. Has
yeah,
intelligent life emerged here?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just a
With
joke.
what
Well,
you
he
and your
was kind of a
countrymen
funny
are
guy.
going
Yeah,
through. Yeah, what you and your countrymen are going through is indicative of like
yeah,
there is
yeah, yeah,
here. There's technology, but there's not a whole lot of intelligence. There's certainly very little wisdom,
yeah.
on our planet. So, but
But
yeah, so that question of intelligent life elsewhere, I think, we absolutely don't know. You absolutely cannot armchair, as we say. You can't do this theoretically. I mean, there's good work to be done thinking about the theory, and that's what my colleagues have been doing. So we talked about biosignatures, right? So the other thing you can look for in a planet's atmosphere is evidence or the light from an exoplanet, a planet orbiting another star. Is you can look for signals of technology, what we call a technosignature. So both biosignatures and technosignatures that's where we're headed using these telescopes. Um, so until we have to look, we have to figure out the best ways to look. But until we actually see something, I think it's just, I mean, I'm very interested in doing the theoretical work to imagine it, but there's no way to know because, right, as people, everybody has this intuition, as I do, like, oh my God, there's so many stars in the sky. How could it not have happened somewhere else? By it meaning, life like ours, intelligent, self-conscious life. And I agree with that. I have that intuition too. But on the other hand, it's about the odds. It's about, well, it's no, it's more about, it's not the odds, it's about the processes that lead to intelligence. So we did a paper, I and Woody Sullivan did a paper on this about 10 years ago, and we calculated the total number of planets in the universe, in the visible universe, that are in the right place for life to form, what's called the habitable zone. And we found out it was 10 billion trillion planets. There are 10 billion trillion planets in the right place for life to form. So that means that the only way that we're the only place it's ever happened, again, it meaning the evolution of intelligent life, is if the experiment of, you can think of every planet as being an experiment. The experiment failed on every other planet, but it succeeded here. Like, you start with simple life, microbes, and then it evolves and blah, 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 and it leads to technological civilization. But we don't really know what goes into that running that experiment. And what if the odds of having everything work out right is 1 in 100 trillion billion, right? There's 10 billion trillion planets, but the odds are 100 trillion billion, 1 in 100 trillion billion. It means you've run out of planets. So it's like it could be, and like I'm not saying I agree with this, I'm just saying you have to consider the possibility that because we don't know what goes into making that experiment successful. So I'm only saying that I believe that it's happened elsewhere, that there's been other technological civilizations. I don't know if there's anybody in the galaxy now, though. It could be that civilizations don't last very long, right? if civilizations, if your average civilization lasts 1 million years, which would be a long time, we've only been a technological civilization for 100 years. If it lasts for 1 million years, then that means still, we might be living in a moment where there's just nobody around us. That the galaxy overall is sterile, if right now, but maybe in another 1 million years, long after we're gone, there'll be another civilization that's relatively close by. So we just don't know. So you got to go look. Could be that the universe is teeming with intelligent civilizations, or it could be that they're incredibly rare. Unless we look, we don't know.
And for example, in our case, we were so close to wiping ourselves out, right? For example, if you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, or from recent
Yeah.
history, yeah. So it seems to me like maybe one of the likely reasons is that they're just doomed to destroy themselves, because if you take our like our planet as an example, of what's happened here, in terms of like human history, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
can be.
And that's an important lesson that comes from thinking about this is that, what it may your ability to overcome the evolutionary psychology or the psychology, the mindset, the cultural characteristics that evolution gave you, the ability to get over that so that you can build a long-term version of your civilization. So like climate change, I think is a great example of this. Like, we know climate change is happening. We know it's happening because of the energy source we're using. It's not like that energy source is, fossil fuels is evil. It's not evil. And it was great. It was a great place to start. But now we know, like, wow, it's going to adversely affect the planetary state on which we depend. And so either we learn how to be smart enough to switch energy sources, or we don't. And I wouldn't extrapolate too much from us, right? Our kinds of minds are probably very unique to what happened on this planet. So I think, you could have lots of other intelligent civilizations that have very different cognitive structures. So, just because we may suck doesn't mean that everybody sucks, right? And that, there may be a lot of paths to having long-term sustainable civilizations that, may be difficult for us, though we may still do it. I'm very hopeful that we'll do it. Maybe hard, but we'll do it. But it may be much easier for other, species that have evolved in very different ways.
But do you, for example, contemplate this kind of fun, thought experiment that when you try and ask your dog about, well, it's clearly a very intelligent, species, in its own right. But if you try and ask it about like about relativity or like the James Webb telescope, it will, won't be able to comprehend, any. It would be just, it would perceive what you're saying as just, a bunch of like noises coming out of your mouth, and
Yeah, yeah.
and like it's amazing because there might be like someone out there that's like far more advanced, and they have thoughts that we just can't even comprehend, because
Or they don't even have thoughts the way we have thoughts. Like, the idea that, one of my favorite movies is Arrival, which, I think deals very intelligently with contact with extraterrestrials. And, the idea they first send in a physicist who's going to like teach them our mathematics, and then, and then that'll be the Rosetta Stone that allows us to, and that doesn't work at all because that's really not how language works. And it really, so, it's possible that what we call a thought is not even how they experience the world, that experience themselves. So, we should expect to be surprised, I think.
but for example, your gut feeling, for why we haven't like as yet seen any signs of life. Like, what would you say? This the most likely explanation maybe for you.
Oh,
Yeah,
I don't think it's, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go on. I'll go on.
It's not a gut. I don't need a gut feeling. It's simple numbers. We haven't looked, right? People have this idea that like ever since Frank Drake did his first SETI search in 1960, that every night astronomers are searching the galaxy for, signs of intelligent life. And that is not true at all. And it's not true for the most mundane reason, which is money. There's never been money for SETI. There's never been funding for SETI. SETI was always marginal. It was done by a few people who were kind of interested. And so Jason Wright, my colleague and friend and collaborators, did a study based on something Jill Tarter suggested, and they counted up all the stars that have been searched with SETI, right? And so the analogy is the ocean. If the night sky is an ocean, and how much of that ocean have we searched for life? And it turns out, if we're using the metaphor of Earth's oceans, we've pulled up a hot tub. That's how much of the Earth's oceans we've looked for. We've looked for a hot tub worth of, water. Now, if you were to like pull up a hot tub's worth of water and like look for fish, and there was no fish in that water, would it make sense to then say, well, I guess there's no fish in the ocean, right? So we just haven't looked. So the idea, that part of the Fermi paradox, of like, oh, we've looked and we haven't seen, it's bullshit. It's like we just haven't looked. And so maybe now we're going to start actually having the money, the funding to start this search, and then we can put a scientific, but we just haven't looked. So we have no idea, basically.
Okay, so then the final question I want to ask you, because I know you don't have much time left, is I come from Ukraine, and we've been dealing with this obviously Russian invasion for more than three years, and like this project is in particular aimed at Ukrainian audience, and we live in this world where like English is so widely spoken, and I have like lots of Ukrainian friends who understand it well and can speak it well. And for those who have some trouble, understand English, I hope to be able to translate this into Ukrainian so that they can get all the ideas. And I just want uh, to ask you, what kind of message would you have for us Ukrainians, maybe on how to deal with such difficult times, like because I find it fascinating, the like people who do what you do, who like study the universe, and as a whole, and who like constantly contemplate these big questions. They have, I think, a certain perspective on the human condition, and that perhaps or not perhaps, that I'm sure that would be useful for all us to have, that could be, that could provide a sense of solace, like you were saying at the start of this conversation, like when you lost about you losing your brother, and how science in a way helped you to cope with that. Maybe I don't know if you can share some like words of wisdom that could provide maybe a sense of solace or for us. I'll be happy to hear.
Well, first of all, I want you to know that you have my and many Americans' support, right? No matter what is going on in this country, we have our own troubles going on in this country, as you know. But many Americans understand the illegality of what Russia did and how brave you guys. I mean, it's amazing. You guys are in the fourth year of that war. And that war was supposedly going to take 2 weeks before, Russian tanks were running through Kiev. So the bravery of the Ukrainians, is the world sees it. Um, and this is a difficult time for the world across. The Ukrainian, what's happening for you guys are one front in a transition that is happening across the world, where the world seems to be stepping back from democracy and stepping once again into like preparing itself for war and hardship. And in my own life, I told you about my brother, but also my mom was, my family. I lost, most of my family on my mom's side was lost to the Holocaust. My mom was what was called a kinder transport. She was put on when she was 9 years old. She was put on a train and sent out of Germany to save her life. And my father was a soldier in World War II who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, fought against the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge, and came back with pretty bad post-traumatic stress syndrome, though nobody noticed, nobody knew what that word was. He came back, he was forever changed by that. So, in my family, I have a lot of history of people experiencing the world imposing on them, right? What is so difficult for what you guys are dealing with is the world imposing itself on you. Your choices have become now narrow and limited. The freedoms that you had before are threatened, and just every day, I can't even imagine what your everyday is like. You know, the anxiety, the fear. And I, you know, I don't have anything I can say that's going to make it better, right? Because there's nothing that can make it better. But I will say this, that next to my bedstand, I have a book, and it is a book of poetry from 750 AD. It's a book of Chinese poetry. And the title of the book is In Such Hard Times, right? And this book was written during what was called the Anshan Rebellion in China in 750 or so. And it was one of the worst humanitarian disasters ever. Like millions and millions of people died from starvation because of this war and starvation. And just that, like, all of us, each one of us is born wherever we're born, and the world around, we have so little control over what happens to us, right? The world does what the world does, and there's so much stupidity, so much ignorance, so much, as the Buddhists say, greed, hatred, and ignorance. And we're just subject to it. And all we can do, right? We don't have any choice about what we're subject to. But what we do have a choice is what we do with it, right? How we respond to it. And our task, I think, is to respond with never lose our humanity, and never lose our compassion for others, and to never lose that sense of beauty, of the richness of the world. And so you guys are on the front line of this, and to not, don't ever let anybody else take your hope from you. And by hope, I don't mean hope that it's going to get better, because it might not get better, but your hope of just like to be able to see the tree outside, and just recognize, wow, what a strange, mysterious world I'm part of. And you can always be there to help the person next to you. Because that's kind of what we're here for. We're here for love, and we're here for compassion. And what science, I think this larger view shows us is, again, that like our particular story, however it turns out, it's kind of all a disaster, but how disastrous it is, we have no control over. But what we can have control over is how we never lose sight of what an extraordinary, beautiful world is, and how tenuous it always was. Every tree, every living thing, every bug is living on the edge of its end. And that makes the world that much more beautiful. So, my message to people is just, the world is always there for you, is always beautiful. It is vast. It is vast and incomprehensible. And I hope that I hope that can offer some comfort in the hardship that you're going through, and that it's love. It's love. Never give up on love, because that's what the universe is. Like, I'm a Buddhist. I'm coming from a Buddhist perspective, and compassion. You can't have enlightenment. You can't know the depths and truth of the universe without compassion for all other living things. So, we're all in it together in one messed up way or another.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful message actually to share, and uh, I'm I'm so happy that you decided to do this with me, and because like I told you, I've been a huge fan of your work, and I've watched many of your interviews, and like I still like reading that book that I mentioned, the Little Book of Aliens. I'm still like in the second half of it, and I think it's just so fascinating for me to that like that we have people who do what you do and who try and answer such big questions of existence, because I've always been excited about them, and I wish I I became I wish I had like the mental capacity to become a scientist, but for some reason I have chosen a different field, but it works well for me, and yeah, I'm just I love talking to people who do what you do, and who spread that joy of knowledge and understanding. And actually I like to think of such people as the DNA of civilization, and like in the same way that genes pass on information from generation to generation. You two guys are like
Yeah.
passing
But
on
listen,
knowledge, and yeah.
But what
Yeah.
you're doing is just as important, right? You're interpreting. You're bringing this, the knowledge from this, very technical stuff that scientists do, and you're bringing it to the public. You're bringing it to people, right? And so you're the mechanism. What you're doing, and so I'm now a huge fan of yours. You are a lot. You're the mechanism, by which this becomes culture, right? If not, it would just be sitting in laboratories, right? But it's got to become part of the human culture if we have any hope, if we're going to have any hope for making it through all the bullshit that we create for ourselves. It's going to be because of kind of the work that you're doing that shows people that, like, look, science is discovering that the world is much bigger and richer and more beautiful than just having our heads down and trying to figure out how we can make money, So, yeah. So there we go. We're fans of each other. We're mutual fans.
No, thank you very much. And I already had the chance to talk to, for example, Sean Carroll, who I'm sure you know, and you might have talked to him, yes, as well. And yeah, people like
That's
Harry
good.
Cliff also, and yeah, all these like wonderful science communicators, and yeah,
You should
I'm just
talk to Marcelo Gleiser, my colleague Marcelo Gleiser as well,
Marcel
because
Coase. I should
one of the
contact, yeah,
yeah he would be interesting. Yeah,
yeah. Uh, and well, I hope that once this war is over, I could probably visit your country. Now, I've never been to the US, and we could go for a beer and
there you
and
go.
yeah, and or maybe I could
And
invite you to come to Ukraine, and we could
sure.
could have a talk, yeah, about this stuff. Thank you so much.